There we go. So, welcome again to the Sanctuary of Peace. This week, I've been talking about the amazing capacity of the soul, which we call the intellect. And I said the intellect is the part of consciousness that manages the mind. The mind is wonderful, but it doesn't have intelligence. So, the intellect is the intelligence that manages the mind. And I said the intellect has the ability to make decisions, good decisions. And the intellect can understand and evaluate and compare. And I said the intellect can even reform the self when we have bad habits that we don't want. We'd like to change. We'd like better habits. The intellect can actually do that. Another point that I made about the intellect this week is that the intellect can understand both the material world of objects and events and people, etc. It can understand that world quite well. That's why we have iPhones and tablets and things like that. But the intellect can also understand the spiritual dimension. So the intellect can understand that we are souls, we are invisible, eternal, energetic beings, not at all part of the material world, but from a different dimension. And the intellect can understand the soul. The intellect can understand qualities such as peace, love, joy, which we can't see with our eyes. You can't put it under a microscope, but the intellect can understand it. And the intellect can understand that as spiritual beings who are not part of the material world, we would have another dimension, which is ours, which we have been to and we can go to. We could call it the home of the soul. The intellect can understand that there is another dimension out there that's very different from the material dimension. And the soul knows about this dimension. And then the other thing that the intellect can understand, which is so important, is that the intellect can understand the existence of a soul or a spiritual being who does not have a body at all, who's not part of this material world at all. Intellect can understand this being. We call this being many different names. In English, we often call this being God. Many different names and many different ways of understanding, but it's the intellect that can understand that there is this supremely benevolent being who is not in this material world and therefore has to be in another dimension. And this being is all goodness, all forms of goodness. Sometimes people say God is love. Sometimes people say God is truth. All of these and more. Everything that's good and benevolent and desirable is within this being. And the intellect can also understand that this being is in a place where nothing changes because there's no matter. Nothing changes. And so this being is eternally benevolent. So it's quite amazing, the intellect. And then the intellect can even connect with this being. And so this is what we're going to practice tonight. Perhaps the, the most refined job of the intellect is to understand and explore and be able to connect with God. To begin with, check that you're sitting up straight. Take a few deep, full, easy breaths. Watch the air enter and leave the lungs. Notice how quiet and soft the breath is. It's easy for you to notice that because the intellect is very good at picking up these subtle cues. As I said, the intellect can understand the physical world, including the body, and also the inner world. Notice how quiet and soft the breath is as you watch the air enter and leave the lungs. And as you notice, let the mind become quiet and soft and relaxed. And now the intellect is noticing both the lungs, which are physical, and the mind, which is metaphysical. So amazing what the intellect is capable of. Shift your attention now to the seat of the soul behind the forehead. Now the intellect is going into the metaphysical reality of the self. And then see yourself as a tiny beam of light, like a very tiny sparkling star. I am the peaceful soul who lives in this body. I'm very different from the body. I come from a different place. And I live here peacefully. In managing the mind, the intellect has to, from time to time, fill the mind with peace, invoke the energy of peace. Because the intellect can be very subtle. It can understand very subtle things, but it can only do that when the mind is peaceful. Let the whole mind be filled with peace. Peace is the nature of the soul. And then bring your awareness very deeply within, still and silent core, and invoke the energy of love. Let that energy flow. Love is also the nature of the self. When we're experiencing our own inner peace, and we're also experiencing the energy of love from inside the self, then the intellect can understand that there would be a being who would be eternally peaceful and eternally loving, and that being would be outside of the material world. Intellect can understand this. And I said a couple of nights ago that one of the abilities of the intellect is to visualize something that's not in front of your two eyes. So, for example, if you went out of your home today, you could visualize right now the place you went to. And in the same way, because the soul understands, the intellect understands both the material world and the spiritual dimension. And so we can visualize the home of light because we've all been there. We have memories in our subconscious. Visualize that place, that dimension of silence and bliss. And visualize yourself in that place. Faraway dimension, very different from Earth. Very light, complete freedom, just little tiny sparkling stars. All very still. And then let your attention be drawn to one uniquely beautiful and attractive star. Not bigger than other stars because the soul has no size, just a little point of light, but very benevolent light, pure light, radiating waves of light, of peace and love and bliss. And this is a soul we would have always known because we souls came from the dimension of light. So this soul is like our spiritual father, very sweet and attractive. And in the presence of this soul, we feel completely safe and secure and loved and accepted. This is the supremely benevolent being, the one for whom human souls yearn to know, to experience. See yourself, the little tiny star, very close, completely comfortable in the presence of this benevolent one. And let yourself absorb the waves of peace and love like light waves, constantly, eternally emanating from this being. And benevolent means that the Supreme Soul cares about us, wants us to be well and happy, and therefore bestows upon us the energies that the soul needs, this pure light. And when we open ourselves to the light of God, the intellect gets cleaned. So God won't do things for us or force us to do anything, but God's light cleans the intellect so that we can then make good decisions, see things clearly. Let yourself, the soul, be cleaned by that pure light. Cleaned meaning let all confusion and conflict and rubbish be removed, all clutter, all negative emotions, all false ideas. Let them all be removed by the light of God. So that your intellect might naturally be strong and truthful. Stay for a few minutes in the company of the Supreme Light. And let your intellect be cleaned. Now bring your awareness back into the body that you inhabit. The intellect is now shifting from the spiritual dimension to the physical. But the intellect can also be aware of both at the same time. So as you're aware of the body and the room around you, also be aware of the divine being inside, and be aware of your eternal relationship with God. And be aware that the intellect can always choose to be positive. Om Shanti. Now, your blessing. We'll take the first one in the stack. A daisy. And the blessing says, your determination is powerful because it is constant. I was talking with a sister today, and she said she heard Sister Shivani talk about this quality, and it has stuck with her, and she tells herself every day the importance of this quality. So I'm going to have to read her this card also. Your determination is powerful because it is constant. Right? Things that are not constant are not powerful. You create energy and then you lose energy, and then you create energy and then you lose energy. But when your determination is constant, you can do anything. So thank you for joining.
Thank you,
Thank you,
sister.
sister.
Shanti.
And
Thank you, Sister Om Shanti. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sister Om Shanti.
okay, Om
Om
Shanti.
Shanti.
Invisible souls.
Yeah.